I'm Stephen Scott, teacher of a combined men's class number 3 in the Finance Committee. The title of our lesson for December 19th, 2021 is Justice and Righteousness Reign, and the printed text is Isaiah chapter 9, verses 2 through 7. Our key verse is Isaiah 9 and 7, and we'll read that verse to conclude our lesson. But first, I want you to consider this. Every graduating high school class has them. In fact, it's essentially the underlying theme of Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and many other social media platforms. The rush to be voted the most popular. It may not be an actual school election, as was the case many years ago when I was in high school, but now we do it by the number of likes we get for a post or the number of followers you have for your social media account. If you didn't get enough likes for something you posted, then you just keep on posting until you get more likes or until you build more followers. But the underlying theme is the rush to be the most popular. So you post what people want to see or what they want to hear. It's a popularity contest. In fact, a young man who was really a kid came to my office just the other day in a new rimmed out red Escalade and a Johnny Dane gold chain looking for an accountant. He's what's called a social media influencer, and I'm sure his popularity pays really well. Now, that wasn't the case for Isaiah the prophet. The office of prophet was instituted during the days of Samuel, the last of the judges. The prophet stood with the priest as God's special representative. Their role was to speak for God, confronting the people and their leaders with God's commands and promises. Now, true prophets like Isaiah were not winning popularity contests. In fact, because of their message, they were usually not very popular at all. But though their message often went unheeded, it didn't stop them because they were not called by man, but they were called by God. So they faithfully and forcefully proclaimed the truth. Even though all historical indications seem to confirm that Isaiah was in fact a blue blood, meaning having access to the palace in Jerusalem and belonging to Judah's wealthy class, he was a champion of the common people, admonishing the southern kingdom of Israel to not make the same mistakes as the northern tribes, but to rely on God and not on their own military might. In fact, in chapter 7, Isaiah counseled King Ahaz not to fear the kings of Aram and Israel, who had aligned themselves together to march against Judah, because the Lord would deliver Jerusalem. Ahaz had only to trust God, but instead Ahaz couldn't bring himself to trust Yahweh, so he sent messengers to the king of Assyria, swearing loyalty to Assyria and asking him for protection instead of asking God. Ahaz went even as far as taking gold and silver vessels from the temple, and these were vessels that were dedicated to God's service, and he sent those vessels to the Assyrian king. He also adopted the worship of the Assyrian gods with a small g. The Assyrian king would do as Ahaz had asked, defeating Israel, the northern tribe, and carrying its people into captivity. But this came at a hefty price to Jerusalem. Judah became a pawn for Assyria, a relationship that impoverished Judah and would lead ultimately to its enslavement. Ahaz was not alone in his disobedience. In fact, because of the sins of Ahaz and the people of Judah, Isaiah witnessed the punishment of the people. He witnessed the very thing he prophesied would happen because of disobedience to God. Isaiah witnessed Judah's defeat by the Babylonian Empire, and he saw Judah's people taken into captivity. Now that brings us to our first section of our outline, end of the darkness, which is found in Isaiah chapter 9, verses 2 through 5. The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. they that dwell in the land of the shadow of death, upon them hath the light shine. That's just verse 1. The gloom of chapter 9, verse 1 will be dispelled by the light of verse 2. It's amazing that even the smallest of light can dispel the darkness. But don't get it wrong. This will not be a small light, but a great light, the kind of light that can only be expected from a great God. The old folk used to say that people who like to sit around in the darkness did so because their deeds were dark. Now, darkness is associated with a number of unpleasant things. In fact, there is not a whole lot that you can do in the dark other than move slowly or walk or wander aimlessly. We tend to be more fearful when we're in the dark, in part because we can't see the dangers that would be apparent if it were light, but also because there is something about darkness that gives rise to our fears. Some folk would even say that nothing good happens after dark. Now imagine the people of God, having dwelled in darkness for a very long time, suddenly blinking at the brightness of God's light. The people are enjoying a new prosperity that is like the celebration of harvest after a tough summer, like the celebration of a victory after a battle. But that's not even the best part. The best part is that God himself has provided it. It is God who has multiplied the nations and God who has increased its joy. It is Yahweh who is the focal point of their celebration, just as it is God to whom we give thanks today for the things he has done. The fact that it's Yahweh who has given the people this cause for celebration means that they can expect a good future as well as a good present. And that's the God we serve. A God that not only provides tomorrow, but who is also providing right now today. Verse number 4 says, as in the day of Midian. We know this is a reference to the story of Gideon and his little army of 300 soldiers that's explained in Judges chapter 6 and 7. Their God used Gideon and his soldiers to win a great victory, fleeing Israel from their Midianite oppressors, lifting the yoke with which they had been burdened. A yoke is a wooden device laid across the shoulders of a pair of oxen to allow them to pull as a team. They may pull a plow or a wagon or any kind of device that's a heavy burden. A yoked pair of oxen could accomplish a great deal of work in a day, and a good farmer would treat his oxen well to keep them healthy. A bad farmer, however, might work a team nearly to death. A life of an ox would be burdensome at best and terrible at worst. Israel under the Assyrians is like an ox. However, here he says, thou hast broken the yoke of his burden. And we have received a similar promise, knowing that his yoke is easy and his burdens are light. When God gives Israel the victory over their oppressors, the Israelites will burn their boots and garments for their fallen enemies as a way of celebrating their victory. That brings us to our second and our last section that we'll cover. Gift of forthcoming peace, verses 6 and 7. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Isaiah earlier in chapter 7 mentioned a child who would be born and who would be named Emmanuel. Now he mentions a child again, a very special child who will enjoy great authority and wisdom and who will establish endless peace. In biblical times, governments were regarded as a burden to be borne on the back of the shoulders of the people. However, this son will do the unusual and shall bear the burdens on his shoulders. And we know that he bore those burdens to the cross where we won our victory. It is surprising that God would raise up a child a newborn no less, to deliver his people and to establish peace, justice, and righteousness. We would expect him to raise up a mighty warrior like King David rather than a child. But when you remember it, David wasn't a mighty warrior when God chose him. He was only a shepherd boy, the youngest of Jesse's son. Such an unlikely candidate that Jesse didn't even think enough to have him in the house when Samuel came looking for Israel's next king. Later, when Goliath threatened the Israelites, David was the unlikely boy who went against a giant armed only with a slingshot and a stone. So why wouldn't God choose a baby to deliver his people? It is God's usual practice to use as his instruments someone who has nothing to offer except God's blessing, just like he uses us today. So he uses a newborn infant. The 4 titles expressed in verse 6 tells of the essential character of this new king. We find that he's a wonderful counselor. The child will be a wise counselor, unlike King Ahaz, whose foolish practices had been so destructive. A mighty God, filled with God's power to lead faithfully, not popular by social media likes, but powerful by God's sovereign might. Everlasting Father. Our Heavenly Father lived for only our earthly father rather, earthly fathers live for only a season, then they are gone. This child will become a father whose reign will last forever. Prince of Peace. The establishment and maintenance of peace is no small achievement, but even his own disciples would bear witness to the Prince of Peace speaking directly to the peace in the midst of a violent storm. Lastly, Christ sits on the very throne of David, having fulfilled the promise with justice and righteousness. This kind of everlasting rule cannot be achieved by mere power or wealth. It requires God's help, and that in turn requires that the ruler in justice and righteousness from that time on, even forever, be Jesus Christ himself. I pray that this time has provided you some useful insights into our lesson on justice and righteousness reign.